WRKE News Now presents a News Now special report with Elijah Wilhelm.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Elijah Wilhelm, and this is a News Now special report. Death of the death penalty. The death penalty's future in modern American culture. Tonight will be a deep look into the future of America's death penalty and the problems that pro-death penalty advocates are facing. I recently got the honor of speaking with Robert Dunham, the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, who has over 25 years of experience as a capital litigator and a teacher of death penalty law. I also spoke with Sister Helen Prejean, who is the leading American advocate for the abolition of the death penalty, and also wrote the book Dead Man Walking that turned bestseller and inspired a movie, play, and opera. Both of these interviews will be featured in this special, and we will also hear parts of an audio recording of an actual execution carried out in the state of Georgia in 1984. Now, this is a sensitive topic, and the tapes, although not graphic, could be considered disturbing to some. Therefore, listener discretion is advised. Looking back, the death penalty is sewn deep into mankind's history. In fact, the first established death penalty laws date as far back as the 18th century BC in China, which is still the world's #1 user of the death penalty today. In the 10th century AD, hanging became the usual method of execution, and in the 16th century, under the reign of Henry VIII, as many as 72,000 people are estimated to have been executed. Some common methods of execution at that time were boiling, burning at the stake, hanging, beheading, and drawing and quartering. Executions were carried out for such capital offenses as marrying a Jew, not confessing to a crime, and treason. The number of capital crimes in Britain continued to rise throughout the next 2 centuries, and by the 1700s, 222 crimes were punishable by death in Britain, including stealing, cutting down a tree, and robbing someone's rabbit. From 1823 until 1837, the death penalty was eliminated for over 100 of the 222 crimes punishable by death. When European settlers came to the New World, they brought their practice of capital punishment with them. The first recorded execution in the colonies was that of Captain George Kendall in Jamestown, here in the colony of Virginia, in 1608. Kendall was executed for being a spy in Spain, and in 1612, Virginia Governor Sir Thomas Dale enacted the Divine, Moral, and Martial Laws, which provided the death penalty for even minor offenses such as stealing grapes, killing chickens, and trading with Indians. Throughout the death penalty's worldwide history, over 100 different methods of execution have been used, and almost 15,800 people have been executed, and that is just here in the United States. That number includes around 1,440 just since the United States Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976 after abolishing it just 4 years previously. Today, the death penalty is still legal in 31 states in the United States, and 36 countries actively practice capital punishment. 103 countries have completely abolished it for all crimes, and 6 have abolished it for all ordinary crimes while maintaining it for special circumstances such as war crimes. 50 countries have also abolished it de facto because they have not used it for at least 10 or more years. In the United States, public support for the death penalty is dropping, the number of executions being carried out is dropping, and the number of death sentences being handed down is at an all-time low, and states are running out of the drugs they use to perform their executions. And that is what brings us here tonight, to discuss death of the death penalty, the death penalty's future in modern American culture.
July the 12th, 1984. The witnesses are now entering the witness room. All witnesses have arrived and have seated. We can proceed if you're ready. The warden is in the process of advising all witnesses that we will now proceed with the court-ordered execution of Armand Stanley. The execution team is now in the process of escorting the condemned into the execution chamber. He is walking unassisted, walks straight to the chair and is seated himself in it. At this time, the condemned has been secured in the chair. He is not not moving. He's just sitting there very passively staring out at the witnesses. The warden is now in the process of reading the essential court order to the witnesses and to the condemned. The execution team members are now in the execution chamber with the headset and the leg band. Perspiration is now being wiped from the forehead of the condemned, and he is secure and ready for execution with the exception of the hood being placed over his head. The hood is being placed on at this time. Stand by for the warden's last telephone check. Well, this is Commissioner. Yes, sir. There are no stays. You can proceed to carry out the official order of the court. Very well. On my count of three. Press your button. 1, 3.
We'll hear more of that tape throughout tonight's special. However, executions through electric chair are no longer carried out in the United States because it has been virtually replaced by lethal injection. First used in Texas in 1982, lethal injection was created as a more humane alternative to the electric chair after people's heads were catching on fire and other graphic botches. However, the method of lethal injection has the highest botch rate of any other method with a 7.12% botch rate, while electrocution has just a 1.92% botch rate. Lethal injection is also getting very hard to carry out. Robert Dunham explains.
So over the summer, Pfizer announced that they were no longer going to be supplying death penalty drugs to jails. All these other companies have blocked their drugs and their use of executions. So what are states doing to be able to carry out these executions now that they can't go to these big markets?
In many states, they're not doing anything. Most states right now are not carrying out executions and are not making serious efforts to carry them out. But in states that want to carry out executions, there have been a number of responses. Some have opted for secrecy in order to try to obtain the drugs without the knowledge of the drug manufacturers who don't want the drugs to be used, the medicines to be used in executing people. And some of the recent litigation has indicated that states have been able to lay their hands on some of the execution drugs despite the wishes of the drug manufacturers. That's one of the things that made Pfizer's action so significant, because Pfizer already had a policy in place against using its medicines for executions. What they recently did was to strengthen that policy to make sure that governments to whom they sell medicines give assurances that they will be used only for medical purposes. Killing prisoners is not a medical purpose, so states will not be able to use Pfizer's drugs to kill prisoners.
Is that legal?
Is it legal for states to represent to pharmaceutical companies that they are going to use the drugs for medical purposes and then instead use them to carry out executions? That's certainly questionable. There are federal law says you can't use medicines except with a valid prescription. So since there is no valid prescription for executions, it simply is not a valid medical purpose to put somebody to death. There is a pretty strong argument that there's a violation of federal law. Is it criminal? Have people been prosecuted? No one has been prosecuted for it. And it's certainly a breach of contract and maybe even constitutes fraud. That all goes to undermine public confidence in the administration of the death penalty by the states, but none of it has been subject to legal sanctions. They've also tightened the restrictions on their distributors. And so a distributor who wants to provide these medicines to states for executions faces losing all of its business with Pfizer. So there's now a unified statement by the major pharmaceutical companies across the United States that they don't want their drugs to be used, and that is making it harder for states to openly lay their hands on them. Some states have then looked to what are called compounding pharmacies to put together individual small batches of execution drugs. But even that is problematic because most of the pharmacies don't want to assist in killing. The American Pharmacists Association has adopted ethical rules saying that it is fundamentally contrary to the medical mission of pharmacists to participate in executions. And one state, for example, Alabama, has indicated that it has gone to compounding pharmacies, all of the ones who are registered in its state, and none of them want to supply drugs. That has led to some more of the secrecy efforts on the part of states, because compounding pharmacists don't want to be on record as publicly going against the ethical rules of their profession. And they understand that it's bad for their business if they are publicly known to be in the business of killing. People who want to get medicines and can get a different compounding pharmacy to prepare a medicine for them are more likely to take their business to a company that is trying to save lives as opposed to a company that's trying to take lives. And another problem with the compounding pharmacies is that they are not as well regulated as the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Big Pharma is regulated by federal law. The compounding pharmacies are not. They come under the auspices of individual states, and the enforcement of safety regulations is not as uniform and not as tight as it is with the federal regulations of the pharmacy market. We now have evidence from Missouri that the pharmacy to which they went in 2013 and 2014 had been involved in nearly 2,000 safety violations, which underscores all of the problems that death row inmates have been warning about, and that the public and the press had been saying you need to have oversight to avoid. That has been successful in some respects, but it has brought the institution of capital punishment under harsh criticism. Americans want the law to be carried out openly so we can assess if states are doing the right thing. And we don't want states engaging in criminal conduct in order to enforce the law. So the kind of Keystone Cops efforts by a number of these states trying to illegally import drugs that have been seized at airports on their way in, or trying to bring drugs into the country and having Federal Express say, I'm not bringing them in, there is no legitimate purpose for these, and the paperwork is not proper. I'm not going to put my business at risk to illegally bring drugs into the country. Things like that have undermined American confidence in the ability of the states to competently administer the death penalty, and it's undermined faith that the states are going to actually carry out this punishment in accordance with the law. That's had profound effect on state legislatures and on the growing conservative opposition to the death penalty, because we're now seeing people saying, you know, if you can't trust the government to fix potholes, if you can't trust the government to run public transportation, why are we trusting the government when it comes to executing people? There have been 156 people exonerated, so we don't have confidence that the right person is being sentenced to death. There's overwhelming evidence of geographic disparity in the imposition of the death penalty. Most of the exonerations have involved allegations, proven allegations, of prosecutorial or police misconduct. And if we distrust government in general, and they can't even get the right drugs to carry out the executions, why would we trust them with this ultimate sanction?
So you talk about these states illegally importing drugs. Is there anything being done to the persons responsible?
So far, nothing has happened to the individuals who've tried to illegally import the drugs. And you know, if you just shift the context and instead of having it trying to illegally import drugs for the purposes of execution, if you had the drugs illegally imported for any other purpose, one would suspect that there would be harsher sanctions that were being imposed.
Even overlooking the drug issues, the death penalty is still in bad shape. I asked Mr. Dunham about the current state of the death penalty here and what he believes the future holds for capital punishment.
The death penalty in the United States is on a long-term decline. In the 1980s, support for the death penalty was as high as 80% as measured in Gallup polls. The most recent Gallup polls show that support has dropped to 61%, and a Pew poll shows that support is down to 56%. And when you ask the public the more practical question, the policy question, what do you think is the appropriate punishment for murder, as opposed to the abstract question, do you support or oppose capital punishment? More Americans now say that they support the life without parole option instead of the death penalty. So we're looking at a 20-year decline, and it's a significant decline, and it's a decline not just in public opinion against the death penalty, but in actual practices. In the last decade, 7 states have abolished the death penalty. In addition to that, studies show that only 2% of the counties are responsible for more than half of all the death sentences imposed in the United States. So most of the counties in the United States don't have anybody who is on death row. Prosecutors are using it less frequently, juries are imposing it less often, and last year we had the fewest number of new death sentences in 40 years.
Why do you think this is? What has changed that this decline is happening?
Well, I think the decline is a product of a sea change in public attitudes about the death penalty. And that sea change is caused by a number of different factors. First, you can't underestimate the effect of the Innocence Revolution. 156 people who had been wrongfully convicted and wrongfully sentenced to death have subsequently been exonerated. Americans don't want to be sentencing innocent people to death. And when you have 156 examples of wrongful capital prosecutions that resulted in death sentences, that gives people pause. In addition, there's been evidence that some individuals who were innocent have almost certainly been executed. So that, at its core, goes to one of the critical issues in capital punishment. Once you make a mistake, you can't fix it. And that's unlike any other punishment that there is. On top of that, the modern death penalty in the United States has been going on for 40 years. And during that time, we have ample evidence that has accumulated that the death penalty continues to be administered in a manner that is arbitrary, both geographically arbitrary and economically arbitrary, and is also employed in a racially discriminatory manner. Jurisdiction after jurisdiction shows that prosecutors exercise their discretionary strikes to remove black jurors from sitting in capital cases. And there is consistent evidence across multiple jurisdictions that shows that you are much more likely to be capitally prosecuted, to be sentenced to death, and to be executed if you are accused of killing a white victim than if you were accused of killing an African American victim. So we've got the question of innocence, we've got the question of arbitrariness, we've got the question of racial discrimination. On top of that, what is also clear is that those counties and states that do not provide meaningful representation for indigent defendants are much more likely to have death sentences imposed. Those states and counties that have provided quality defense representation have many fewer death sentences imposed. So there is this expression that is called capital punishment because if you've got the capital, you don't get the punishment. And that seems to be the case. When people are adequately represented and have the opportunity to present a meaningful case for life, juries are much less likely to impose death sentences.
So the death penalty has had a long past, obviously, in the United States. Do you see it having a much longer future?
The future is in doubt. More and more states are abolishing the death penalty. The counties in the states that have it have seen fewer and fewer counties pursuing it, and the counties in which it is pursued seem to be limited. And there are certain things that we can say about those counties. 2% of the counties in the United States are responsible for more than half of all the death sentences in the United States. And these are counties, these tend to be counties that have systemic problems in the administration of criminal justice. These are counties with prosecutors that exercise their discretion to be much more punitive across a range of sanctions. So you'll see harsher treatment of juveniles. You'll see, in many instances, racially disproportionate prosecutions and racially disproportionate exercises of death penalties. As I mentioned earlier, in many of these jurisdictions, you will see prosecutors exercising their discretionary strikes to remove African Americans from juries. These tend to be counties in which there are higher rates of police violence against civilians, and more particularly against African Americans. So there are areas where there are systemic problems. And the fact that so few counties use the death penalty, and the ones that do are counties in which there are continuing questions about the fairness of the criminal justice system as a whole, has continued to undermine public support for the death penalty.
My count of three. Operation button. 1, 3. The execution is now in progress. When it first surge entered his body, he stepped and I heard a pop as if one of the straps broke, but I can't tell from this vantage point. He is still at this time sitting there with clenched fists with no other movement. From my vantage point, it seems that the inmate has relaxed somewhat. His fists are still clenched, but there's no movement from the condemned. It appears when the execution was completed and the power was off, it was pretty visible that he relaxed even more than what it seemed before.
When Catholic nun Sister Helen Prejean was asked by a friend in 1982 to become a pen pal to a death row inmate, she had no clue just how much her life was going to change.
Well, I call it sneaky Jesus. When he asked me, would you like to write to somebody on death row? I don't even know the person's going to be executed, because we hadn't executed anybody in Louisiana or anywhere in the United States for 20 years. So I wrote the man thinking I was only going to be writing letters. And I thought, well, I'm an English major, I could send a few poems and stuff. And we could have a good little communication. I never dreamed they were going to kill him, much less that I would be there. Because I'm sure if the beginning had been, hey, you want to write a letter to a death row inmate, you can be with him when he's executed, it's going to change your whole life. I couldn't have said yes. Can you write a letter to a death row inmate? Yeah, sure, I could write a letter. And then I visit him, and then I accompany him. And then when he's executed, I am saying to him, you look at my face. And that was grace inside me. All of it was grace.
Today, Sister Helen is 77 years old and still traveling the world to talk about her death penalty experiences. She has written 2 books, one titled The Death of Innocence, an eyewitness account of wrongful executions, and her other, Dead Man Walking, which inspired an award-winning film with the same title, starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn. Throughout her life, she has experienced 6 executions, including 1 in Virginia. I got to talk to her one-on-one, and I asked her what it was like to witness an execution.
It's, on one level, Elijah, it is very surreal. It's a scripted death, okay? Now they're taking the person out of the holding cell, they're walking him down the hall, they're strapping him in, now they're injecting the fluid, now the warden, nods his head, the whole procedure begins, and then the person's dead. So it's scripted. So I've had some journalists just say, it's just like it's so surreal. It's death by formula. For me, it was all people I knew. So I know the person whose life is being ended. And I know their crimes. That's of the ones that have been guilty, of the 6 people, the last 2 I was with were innocent. And so it's just so impossible to try to describe this. And I could see it going on. I go, oh, now they're killing him. Now he's looking at me. Now I'm saying to him, his last words for him to see my face. And then it's over. There's somebody appointed by a physician who goes and puts the stethoscope up, and the person's dead. And they come out and do a press conference. It's a formulaic press conference, too, after these death, executions. The press kind of asks formulaic questions. What was his last meal? What did he have to eat? And then they try to get a response from the victim's family. Look at the terrible crime he did. Justice was done tonight. Now we can have closure and healing. And that's a formula.
Does it ever get easier?
Never. But it transformed my life, because after the first execution of Pat Saunier, he was the first. They killed a man with fire one night because Patrick Saunier was executed in the electric chair. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. So I had descended in the very first journey with a man on death row. He and his brother had done an unspeakable crime. They killed 2 teenage kids in cold blood, and I was absolutely horrified by what they had done. But then as I began to make my way over to the victims' families, to the ones who had had the loss, and some victims' families, of course, and you would expect this, especially when you have the state prosecutor saying, we're going to get the death penalty for you, you deserve this justice, they killed your child, so it's right that they give up their life. But the father of the boy who was killed by Eddie Saunier and Pat Saunier, his brothers, he was on a different page. And he was saying, sister, why didn't you come see me sooner? You can't believe the pressure we're under with the death penalty. Everybody is saying to me, Lloyd, you got to be for the death penalty or it looked like you didn't love your boy. And I'd never known that victims would be under any kind of pressure, that they felt that's what they had to do. Lloyd LeBlanc's story about the loss of his son David and making his way out of that hatred and that desire for vengeance to a place where he could be whole and not lose the love and integrity inside his being by being overcome by a desire for vengeance and hatred. And it's not a journey everybody makes. And I'm the last one to give him any kind of advice because I haven't had a loved one killed. But he showed that it's possible. And it's interesting about the victims' families because part of what's shifting the tide on the death penalty is victims' families are becoming more vocal about how the death penalty doesn't help them. So 10 years ago when New Jersey repealed the death penalty, 62 murder victims' families testified to the Judiciary Committee there of New Jersey saying, don't kill for us. The death penalty re-victimizes us because we're put in this holding period for 10, 20 years if the execution ever happens. And all this time we're waiting for our closure. We're waiting for our healing, which never comes. So don't kill for us. It re-victimizes us. And so with their voices out there, it's beginning to do a shift. There are a number of other things creating the shift and why the death penalty is in decline too, but that's definitely one of them.
So you talk about the death penalty being in decline. What do you see as its future here in the United States?
It's going to be in a museum. We're going to see the death penalty. We're going to see the chair, the electric chair, the lethal injection gurney. We're going to see the gas chamber. We're going to see all the methods we use for killing people behind those blue velvet ropes. And kids are going to go in there with their parents, and they'll say, Daddy, what's that? And they'll say, well, son, there was a time in this country where the Supreme Court had decided it was not against the Constitution to kill some criminals for their crimes. But we don't do that anymore. And some of the factors, Elijah, are, first of all, the lethal injection thing has gotten very complicated because the European country that made the drugs found out that their drugs, which were, they had manufactured for humane reasons to alleviate suffering, was being used for executions, and so they cut off the supply. So states have been forced now to go to, to put together drugs to experiment to kill people. They're just mixing concoctions, and so far the Supreme Court has let them do that. There's no transparency in states. I don't know that Virginia has any transparency, and I've heard that Texas secretly gets whatever drugs Virginia's using and mixing together to use in Texas, and they are killing people with dispatch on a regular basis. But the Supreme Court hasn't demanded transparency, either of the technicians or people who are administering the drugs. So sometimes, like in the execution of Clayton Lockett in Oklahoma, you had very inexperienced people. They didn't even have an ID kit. They were injecting the drugs into the muscles of Clayton Lockett. And they finally had to call the execution off because he would die. And then he died of a heart attack. So the word was they killed him while they were trying to execute him. But who's watching and asking for transparency? Now, who will be administering the drugs? It's all pretty much a secret operation. And all of that. So the lethal injection thing and the controversy over it, Oklahoma recently, using the wrong drugs to kill Charles Warner and lying about it, trying to cover it up. And then we're about to use that same wrong drug, potassium acetate, to kill Richard Glossop. But with the world watching the Richard Glossop case, there were a number of us involved in bringing that to the attention of the world. Susan Sarandon got involved. We're on the Dr. Phil show. Richard Branson got involved. Pope Francis got involved. They didn't dare use that drug again, as they had used on poor Charles Warner and killed him without anybody knowing it. And then that guy was dying, saying, I got acid in my veins. I'm on fire. And they hid the fact that they'd used potassium acetate to kill that man. And so anyway, so now with the world attention, with the lethal injection drug, so it's helping the American public to say, wait a minute, this is really worth it. I mean, what we're talking about here is that people will get life without parole. The public is as safe as if they get life without parole or if they're executed. Why do we need the death penalty? And the other factor in it is the extreme cost. I was just in California, and because they really pay their defense and they really pay their prosecutors and they pay people all the way up the line through numerous appeals, and the average wait for an execution of 744 people. California is the largest death row in the country. The average wait is 25 years. And then what happens? They've only executed 13 people in all this time.
So how do you think the death penalty will be abolished, and do you think that will happen in our lifetimes?
States are going to do it state by state, but then I believe the Supreme Court is going to do it. And if you look at the Glossop v. Gross case, and you look at Justice Breyer's long opinion, in which he stated all the ways that he believes the death penalty as it's practiced, not the theory of the death penalty, which is that it's supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst murderers. And it could never work, because though you have a general principle, now go after the worst of the worst murderers, first of all, that guideline is so fuzzy. Who knows what worst of the worst means? So then it's left up to the discretion of local prosecutors. And then politics enters in, culture enters in, like Oklahoma with Richard Glossop. Bob Macy single-handedly got 54 death penalties. And it fit into the politics. He was reelected 3 times he was in office because the people wanted him to be tough on crime. So he'd brag about how many death penalties. We have that in Louisiana, too, a lot in the deep South states. The 10 former states that practiced slavery are responsible for over 75% of all executions. That's the real executioners, are the deep South states, and it's where poverty and race play the biggest role in it. And so you have this general principle of the Supreme Court in Gregg v. Georgia, where they put the death penalty back only for the worst of the worst murderers, but they leave it up to the individual discretion of a prosecutor to be square one of the trigger of the process. How could it not be affected by politics and culture? And so that, and of course, Breyer's pointing that out in the opinion. And then you see that everybody selected for death is poor, and the race factor in it. And where you look for race, you can look on death row and say, oh, well, look, it's about 45% white and about 45% people of color, with a mixture in there of, when I say people of color, are minorities. But it's the race of the victim. That's where the race is really coming out, because overwhelmingly we see now, and this is 30 years of practice, 30 years of doing this, overwhelmingly it's when white people get killed that the death penalty is sought. And that's true in the federal death penalty too, because we not only have it in the states, we have a federal death penalty. Overwhelmingly when white people are killed, and when people of color are killed, who are over 50% of all the homicides in this country, the death penalty is seldom sought. So what does that tell us? It's supposed to be the worst of the worst, but the profile of the 1,400 plus people who have been executed and the 3,000 people on death row, overwhelmingly 8 out of every 10 of them are there because they killed a white person. So that profile says, and they're all poor, and they killed a white person. So you want to know what the worst of the worst is? Did you kill a white person, for starters, where black lives don't matter? Literally, black lives don't matter when they're the homicide victims, because nobody's outraged over their death.
In the upcoming election, Oklahoma has added a decision on the ballot for voters to vote on that, if passed, would protect the death penalty under the state's constitution. I asked Sister Helen what kind of effect she thinks this will have on the abolishment of the death penalty that she is so convinced is coming.
What that says to me as a community organizer of this is you got to go educate the community like mad. Because, you know, these are complicated issues, and you have to educate the community on it, or it's going to pass. And so now they want to put it as part of the Constitution. That's interesting, because it's going to have to pass constitutional muster, and of course the Supreme Court has approved it, but that'll be another thing. I know in Louisiana, our legislature passed that you should introduce the death penalty for the rape of a child. It passed. Everybody in the state got political points for supporting it, even though people were saying, this will never pass constitutional muster with the Supreme Court, because they've already declared that it's murder that is the only crime for which you can get the death penalty, not rape. But they passed it anyway because they got political points for it, and the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld it. So that's what's going on in Oklahoma. It's all the politics playing out. And God knows, I don't know what's going to happen with it.
There is one thing, however, that could solve a lot of the problems that the death penalty is facing. Its name is nitrogen-induced hypoxia. Earlier this year, Oklahoma passed it as a backup execution method should lethal injection be ruled unconstitutional or become no longer available. According to a report that was conducted at the request of the state, this method would be a much simpler process to carry out, as no medical professionals would be necessary, nitrogen is readily available, and the process would not require the cooperation of the condemned. Nitrogen is the most common gas in the Earth's atmosphere, comprising over 78% of the air that you are breathing right now. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless, and it is safe for humans under the normal circumstances. However, when you overly enrich an environment with nitrogen, the nitrogen displaces the oxygen, and this causes hypoxia and death. This process, unlike the processes used in the gas chamber executions, allows the body to expel carbon dioxide buildup that is normally associated with the respiratory cycle, which can prevent complications that we saw with gas chamber executions. Although the study cites experiments in suicides using this method and claims that it would be a quick and painless death, Sister Helen is less than convinced.
What do we know about killing people with nitrogen-induced hypoxia? So what does that mean? How do you die when you have nitrogen-induced hypoxia? What's that like, to die like that? What happens in your body? Who knows, right? But because the states have been allowed to, okay, go ahead, well, look, let's go try this now, and let's see if that kills people better. And so, of course, that's what they're going to do. That's their institutional bent as a state. No, we haven't been wrong about this. We're doing the right thing, and we're convinced of it. So let's just get us a new method, and let's go in there and let's keep doing these executions. That's their thinking.
Even with hypoxia now in play, Prejean is confident that the death penalty has exhausted its final appeal.
We're on our way out, but human beings, I can't begin to tell you the suffering that's going on in individual lives, and mothers with their children, victims who are waiting for relief that never comes, or closure that never comes. Bud Welch says his daughter Julie was killed in Oklahoma City bombing, and at first all he could think of was getting Tim McVeigh. But he worked his way through it, and he finally came to realize, and he says this himself, even if I'd watched Tim McVeigh die, I'd have been one of the victims' families. There were 168 human beings killed by Tim McVeigh. So here's your moment of justice now. You get to watch him die. He said, even if I had done that on that closed-circuit television, when I would come home afterwards, the chair in which my daughter, Julie Marie, sat would still be empty.
It ran too smooth, Ralph, but don't screw it up next time. Okay, I second what Dave said. Dave, smooth job. Okay, we appreciate you. Give us another one. Thank you, Ralph. Okay, thank you.
If you're interested in learning more about the death penalty, then please check out Death Penalty Information Center at deathpenaltyinfo.org. You can also pick up Sister Helen's books at a local bookstore or online. A huge thanks to both Mr. Dunham and Sister Helen for their time and for making this special possible. For WRKE News Now, I'm Elijah Wilhelm. Thanks for listening.